All right. Many times on a website, the user is required to enter data in order to do something. Um, Examples of that include if you're placing an order somewhere. If you're ordering items, you select the items that you want, and when you're done, you need to enter credit card information, you need to enter your name, your address, maybe some other relevant information. So the user enters that into an HTML page, a form, and that information gets sent through the internet to a web server. And the web server is running code that's a little different than HTML. The web server is running some sort of application that is written in languages called server-side programming or server-side scripting. And that might include things like PHP, Python, ASP.NET, JSP, Java servlets. There's a number of different technologies, but they all basically do the same. They can take data from a user and process it some way. Now, that might involve saving the data in a database or doing some other activity with the data. So typically what we have is this. The user gets from the server a form. The user enters data into the form, sends it to the application. The application does with something with it, like that's not shown here, like maybe updates a database or whatever, or reads from a database, and then sends the results back to the client browser. You see this when you Google something. If you go into Google and you were to Google HTML, that information gets sent to the script, which actually prepares a web page just for you. So if you Google anything HTML relative paths, or for example, anything you enter into the form gets sent to the server, and the server creates a custom web page just for you in the response to the data that you've entered on the form. Now, in this class, we're not going to study this part of it. We're not going to study the server-side scripting and how the data is processed by the server. You study that in classes such as CISS232, CISS243. All right. That uses its own languages in addition to HTML to accomplish those tasks. But in this class, we are going to talk about a form and how you can enter data into a form and how that data gets sent to the web server. So since we are not writing the server-side script ourselves, we are going to use someone else's server-side script to process. Now, Google, for example, allows you to post or send data to their script to do a search. So you can include actually a Google search on your web page. And that's essentially what I did in the first example. First example we're going to look at, I have a search page. That page has a couple of things as far as forms go. It has a text box and it has a submit button. So I can go in here and type in a text box. The text box is something I wanted to search for. So CSS borders. And I do a search and I get the results for CSS borders. So all I've done effectively is wrote the first page of the search process. I wrote the page where you collect the data and send it to the server. And then the server takes that data, queries Google's databases, and prepares results. So let's look at the code that does this. Code is actually very simple. We have a form tag. And the form tag sort of goes around everything that you want to send to the web server. In our case, what we want to send is we want to send something that's contained in a text box. So The input tag is used for a variety of different ways of inputting data in. If you think about it, there's a number of ways that you can input data into a form. There are just plain text boxes where you can type anything in. There's also drop downs. There's also radio buttons, check boxes, text areas, and maybe a few other things. But the form tag goes around everything that we want to send to the server. So what do we want to send to the server? We want to send the value of some text that's included in a text box. And we need something to actually make the whole process happen. And that's what the submit button does. So type submit is a submit button. So if we're viewing this page, the form is everything including these two things, the text box and the button. This is the text box, and this is the submit button. And all that is wrapped up in a form tag. Now, it's possible to have more than one form tag per page. However, oftentimes you will only have one form per page. And you're not going to have a separate form tag for every single item that you're sending to the server. You're going to have a form tag for every group of items that you're going to send to the server. Think of the form tag as being like an envelope. And in the envelope, you're going to stuff everything that you want to send to the web server. Now, in this case, we only have the one field that we're really interested in sending to the web server, and that is the text box. All right. So input type equals text is a single line of text. All right. You might notice that the text box has a name of Q. And that has to match the name that the web server is expecting the data to come under. And the way I figured this out is I sort of did some reverse engineering. So I did a Google search. And searched for something. And I notice when I do that, the address of the server side code that gets called is https google.com/search $Q equals HTML5. So the thing that we're searching for on Google appears in a text box that is called that's called Q. And so whatever value we type into this text box on the previous page gets sent to the server as part of the query string. Everything after the question mark and the URL is called the query string. And it consists of pieces of data, all right, the name of the data field, an equal sign, and then the value of the data field. And the Q is the name that Google is expecting. So if I want this to work, I have to make sure my text box is named Q. If I were to call it something else and run it, it doesn't work. It doesn't do a query. It doesn't see that that Q value was set, and therefore it doesn't know what to search for. So it just displays the home page. So if you're going to use another server-side script, you have to know what the data is expected to be called on the query string. Now, usually, that's not a problem because usually you are the person that's making both the form and the server-side script that processes the form. So you just make sure that the server-side script is expecting the data in the same name that the form is providing, and vice versa. You make sure that this matches up with the code that you put in the server-side script. Now, sometimes in a larger organization, if you're working on something, you might be working on the form and someone else might be working on the page that processes the form, in which case you would have to communicate with them to find out the name that they're expecting the data under. I guess in some rare circumstances, if you like we're doing here, if you're using someone else's server-side script, you have to maybe do a little digging or reverse engineering or review the documentation to see what you call the form items to make sure that it matches what the server-side script is expecting. So I know that it's expecting a thing called Q, and that's what's going to be queried. The submit button, it's not expecting the submit button to be called anything, so I don't really have to give the submit button a name. The way that forms work is everything that has a name gets sent to the server. Well, in our case, all we're interested in sending for a Google search is the name of the thing that we want to search for. In reality, there's a lot of other data that's passed as well, but all you really need is the search term to make it work. And that search term is called Q. Now, if you look at the form tag, you'll notice that there are two attributes to the form tag. The first one is what is the name of the server-side script that you want to call. In this case, we want to call a server-side script that is https://www.google.com/search. How did we get that? We got that by actually doing a Google search and looking for everything before the question mark. Everything before the question mark is the URL that we want to call when we're submitting a form. And just like the form fields, oftentimes we're the same person writing the form as is defining the server-side script, so it's no problem. We know what that name is. If we're not the person, either we look at the documentation, we ask the person, or we, in this case, do a little bit of reverse engineering to see, oh, this is what's called. So that's the name of the server-side script that gets called, the action. Every form should have these two elements, the action and the method. The method describes exactly how the data is being passed from your form to the server-side script. In this case, we're using the get method. The get method sends the data as part of the URL, part of the query string. The other method that we can use is post. And if we send it via the post method, we get an error. And the error is the method request post is inappropriate for the URL. In other words, Google doesn't allow for you to do a post as your method, to use post as your method, and it displays an error. All right. How did I know to use get? I know because I can see a query string here. If I use post, I'm going to send the data, but it's not going to be included in as part of the URL. It is hidden. It's part of what is called the form collection or the form object. All right, so because the get method shows the stuff that's part of the URL as part of the URL, typically it's used for data that we don't care if someone sees or not. All right. If we were sending something like a password, we definitely would not want to use the get method because that would make the password visible on the URL. We could do some kind of encrypting, but that's a little bit more of an advanced topic. Now, one advantage of using the get method is we could also send users to that page by simply coding the URL. In other words, I can take the URL that gets generated from this oops. Oh, I changed it back to get. Oh, I forgot to save it. If I use the get method, I can actually take this URL and create a link for it. And I'll call it link to HTML search. And click to that. Oh, I stand corrected. It's not allowing me to do that. Not sure why. Must be some. Oh, I have I have extra quotes here. And it takes us to that. This might not be too terribly useful with regards to using Google search, but if you wanted to do maps, if I wanted to do a map and search for Lorain County Community College, I could actually copy this URL and post the data or create a link to send all that. And it's kind of cool. Well, you can't do that if it's posting the data. It has to be part of the URL in order to do that. Takes it right to there. All right. Are there any questions at this point? If you do, feel free to click your microphone and just shout out your questions. In addition, after this class, if you have questions about the lab, either answer when I ask at the very end if there are any questions, or you can email them to me and I'll address them that way. So this in a nutshell is the basic idea of forms. Again, this bit about the link at the bottom is sort of a side thought that shows you what you can do if you use the get method instead of the post. But again, the post method is more secure. The basic idea of the form is like this, though. We have all these things which are form controls, different input objects, and the type specifies the type of input object it is. So in this case, type equals text, mean that it's a text box. The name represents what we're going to call it and what the server expects it to be called. Those need to match up. So we're calling this text box Q, and that's good because that's what the web server expects. So a type of text is for a text box. A type of submit is the thing that actually submits the form. Well, what does it mean by submitting the form? It means sending all the form data to a URL. And what's the URL? The URL will be the action of the form. And we can send the data via two different methods, get or post. Get sends the data as part of the query string. Post sends the data as part of a form collection, which is not visible as part of the query string. Okay, so that's the very, very basics of form. But anyone that's worked on the web for a while and or even just used the web for a while knows that there's other things other than plain old text boxes. All right, there's a number of other things, and that's what we're going to look at in the second example. In this one, we have all the information that you might have when you're registering for a website, for example. You know, what's your name? What's your email? Age range? Password you want to use? Notice how the password blanks out the characters as I'm typing. We have radio buttons where this is the favorite. You have to select just one. These are called radio buttons. Favorite sport, you have to select just one. And then, have I read the terms and conditions? And do I want to be on the mailing list? These are check boxes. So we have several different controls. We have the text box, which we've seen before. We have a drop-down list. We have radio buttons. Radio buttons are where you have to select just one item from the list. Another set of radio buttons. Then finally, check boxes, where check boxes work independently. I can set each of them to yes or no. And then finally, I have a comments field that is sort of a free-form text that I could put multiple lines in. This looks like an interesting website. I look forward to using it. And we can scroll up and down inside of it. So text, this is called a text area, and it's like a text box, but it is allows for multiple lines. Notice also that we've styled this a little bit. All right. This is just one form. It does have two submit buttons, by the way, and we'll talk about why it has two submit buttons later on. But we have sort of different sections of the forms that have a little border around them along with the title of the section. Personal info, preferences. Also, these are lined up nice. Let me show you what this looks like without any CSS code. So let me bring up this page and remove the CSS code temporarily. All right. Doesn't look horrible, but things don't line up as nicely as it does. And we get these bullet points. So with the CSS code, we make it look a lot nicer. All right, first we're going to look at the HTML controls for the form, and then we're going to look at the styling to make sure that we understand that. All right. There's another thing with forms, and that's called the label object or the label tag. The label tag is used for accessibility. If you're using a screen reader, the screen reader can read the label tag to the user when you're in a form field. So this is a label for the thing that has an ID of txt name. So the label tag is matched to the form control by the ID of the form control. This for is the ID. And again, the nice thing I'm using about Visual Studio Code is if I hover my mouse over it, it actually explains to me how this works. All right. And it tells me what a label tag is. All right. So what this is saying is this label name is a label for this ID. And it's a text box. I have an ID and a name both on the same field. You will typically have that. The ID is for things like the label and for if you write any JavaScript. And the name is for sending the information to the server. It would be nice if you could get away with just having one, but they do serve different purposes, so you typically will need both of those. That's the text box that's at the top of the page. Actually, there's two text boxes for the name and for the email. Name and email. Pull this over to the side. Name and email. Next thing we have is a drop-down. Drop-down still has a label tag, just like the other ones do. Label for DD age. DD age is the ID. And this is not an input tag. It is a select. And a select, when you see the word select, think of drop-down. And a drop-down is where you give the user a limited number of selections. In other words, name, you know, there's all kinds of names in the world, and no one knows them all, right? So you have to just allow that to be a free-form text field, just like email address. But if we're doing age ranges, we use whatever makes sense for our application, and we want to limit the user to select something. For example, in this example, the valid values for the age are 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're either in the 0 through 18, 19 through 35, 36 to 60, or 61 plus age range. We don't want them the ability to put 22 in this drop down. All right. So there's no option for 22. Now, options consist of two things. They consist of the text of the option, which is between the start and end of the option tag, and then finally, the value of the option. The text of the option is what the user sees. Notice that's what we see when we look at the dropdown. We see, please choose age range 0 to 18, 19 to 35, 36 to 60, and 61 plus. That's what we see on our screen. The value is the value that gets passed to the server. So in our case, our server is expecting the value of 1 if they're in this first age range, and so on and so on. We added sort of this dummy choice at the beginning because we don't want the person to simply default to the youngest age range. We want to make sure that they actually select one of the age ranges. And then we can validate to make sure that they've selected one of the valid age ranges. So select consists of a bunch of options. Each option has the text that appears, and it has the value. And you will use this when there's only a limited number of choices. For example, if you were ordering a pizza, your three choices for the pizza might be small, medium, and large. All right. You can't say, well, I wanted a little bit bigger than the small, but not quite as big as the medium. That's not a valid choice. Has to be one of those three, small, medium, and large. Therefore, maybe you would use a drop down for that field because you could limit the users to only picking small, medium, and large. All right, next thing we have is a password. And the same idea approved continues, where we have the label tag for that matches the name of the field. The difference is the type is a password type. A password type is a type like a text box. The only difference is when we type in a value, it doesn't get echoed to the screen. All right. Then we have a couple more fields that we're going to look at. One of them is the radio button. Each of the radio button fields has their own label. It's a label for the thing that's an idea of rock, country, and hip hop. Notice in this case, the name for all three of them are the same. That's what groups items together to form a radio button. Is they all a group of radio buttons all have the same name. So, for example, music and sport. The radio button is named RB Sport. The music, the RB radio button name is RB Music. So I can click on this, and it will change this option and this option only, whereas I can click on this one without changing this one. So it's called a radio button because it's like the radio buttons in your car. If you choose one station, you stop playing the other station. And the radio button name is what groups them together. Each of the individual choices has its own ID associated with it. Because remember, only one thing on a page can have a given ID. And finally, they have a value. And the value is what gets sent to the server. We'll look at the data being sent to the server in a minute here. So those are those two radio buttons. We have checkboxes, and checkboxes, each checkbox works independently. So I can check both of them. I can uncheck both of them. I can check one and not the other, or so on. Checkboxes are useful if you have a yes or no question. Have I read the terms and conditions? That's either a yes or no. Do I want to be on the mailing list? That's either a yes or no. Radio buttons are useful when there's more than one choice, and the choices are mutually exclusive. And the same thing with drop downs. The difference between the two is how much space they take up on the screen. So if I had a very long list of items, I might make a drop down. Whereas if I had a very small list of items, I might make it a radio button, because then the user sees all of them at the same time. The comments are a text area, has a label associated with it that's associated with this ID. And then finally, I have a submit button. I have two submit buttons because sometimes the user can do different things depending on what button they press. For example, I could have a button to save this information, or I could have a different button to delete the information, or a button to save the information, another button to restore the defaults to the form. All right, so that's why it's possible to have two buttons. Now notice all of this is one form. All of this is one form. The action is this script, which is the script that a textbook publisher that I use provides for students to test their forms out with. And the method right now is post, so it will send the data to the script without putting it on the query string, so it will be invisible. So if I were to press it now, I go to that script. There's no get variables, and these are the post variables. Notice the button I click got sent. I click button 1. For all the other ones, it has the name equals and the equals that I put, the value that I put in the form. In the case of DD age, it has the value of the option that I selected. So it has the option of 4. RB Music and RB Sport has the name of the radio button that I actually selected. So since I selected this one, it has this value. If I selected this one, it has this value. So let's review the form controls we have. Text boxes we've gone over in the first example, but therefore a single line of text. Dropdowns is where you have a list of options that are mutually exclusive, and the user can pick one of them. Often it will use when there's many choices because you don't see all the choices all at once. You only see them if you click on the dropdown. Password is like a text box, except it does not show you the characters as you are entering them. Radio button allows you to pick one of a group, and the groups are defined as having the same name. So these 3 form a group. They're all radio buttons, and the user can select at most one of those. Same thing with here, this radio button. Checkboxes work independently. You can think of them as being a yes or no question. And then finally, submit buttons. Send the data to the server to be processed. And we can tell in our server-side script what button is processed in case we want to do 2 different things. If I change this method to get, it works the same way. Well, let's not change it to get right off. With post, notice we don't see the data on the query string. If I change it to get and save it, we see the data on as part of the query string is a set of ordered pairs, the name of the field, an equal sign, and the value from the form. Are there any questions about this so far? Okay. You might notice that there's no guarantee that anything is entered. In other words, I cannot choose something and it won't give me an error. There are things that we can do to prevent that from happening. That is, there's things that we can do to require data that is being entered. And we'll look at some of those in a minute here. One of the ways we can do that is via JavaScript, which again, that's not a topic for today. We will not be covering JavaScript in too much detail in this class, and we're definitely not talking about it today. Other things we can do is, in addition to these basic form types, there's a whole set of new form types that are available under HTML5. And if you look in the module, you'll see some new form tags that allow us to enter things maybe a little more precisely. So for example, instead of just having a text box, we can allow the user to, we can force the user to have to enter numbers in or other formats. And here's a list of them. Here's the basic types. Some of these are not used that often. There's a few more of them. Reset button is one that I don't like to use, so I'm not going to talk about it. I don't like to be able to clear out the data because a lot of times you will accidentally click that and enter a whole bunch of data and click it in. A color allows you to use a color picker. Something like this might be useful if you were picking a color for a theme that you're going to use. And it's not supported rather on every browser. On a browser that is not supported, it works just like a text box. So we can enter date. And the nice thing about this is it requires you to enter the date. So take some time to review all these different input types. The ones that are particularly useful, let me go in and point them out. The button's useful. We'll talk about that when we talk about JavaScript. The checkbox is useful. The date is useful. The email address is useful. Month number is useful. You can require that just a number is entered or is allowable. So in this case, I can enter a number between 1 and 5. The type is number. There's the ID and name. The minimum and maximum is 1 to 5. So I can't enter a value of 6 in here. Gives me an error right away. A range is valuable because then you can enter a minimum or a maximum. And there's like a little slider control that you can use to pick, you know, how much did you like this film? You can either like it a lot or like it a little bit. And it converts that to a number when it gets sent to the server. So again, going down these and picking which ones are particularly useful. Button, checkbox, date, email, number, password, radio, range, submit, time, URL. Those are all useful. So take a time to go through this tutorial to look at all the different input types that we didn't really cover in much detail today. Because, for example, for many forms, you can really write a better form if it restricts the user to only putting in valid data to begin with. The nice thing about these is if your browser doesn't support one of these fields, one of these form types, it defaults to just a plain old text box. So if you remember, I had an Am I Used web page I talked about before. Not am I use, can I use? I could type in input types. And fortunately nowadays, most of them are supported across all the browsers. This was more of an issue in the past when users were using older browsers that might not support these new types. So by all means, take advantage of the HTML5 input types. All right. Now, as far as the styling of the form goes, I'm going to bring up the form along with the CSS for the form. First thing, a form is really just a list of items that we're going to send to the server. Therefore, I'm going to make it an unordered list. I'm actually going to make each section of it a unordered list. In other words, the personal information and the preferences are each unordered lists. Each section of a form is called a field set. It's a way of grouping fields together. That is to organize it for the user that's entering data. It really has no impact over the data that is sent to the server. Each field set can have a legend. So if we're looking at this, field set, legend, personal information, and it contains these fields. So I can put the form as having a border of 2 pixels and a black dotted. So the whole form has a dotted border around it. I made it 50% of the page with a minimum width of 400 pixels. So if it's bigger than, my screen is bigger than 800 pixels wide, it's 50%. Otherwise, it won't get any smaller than 400 pixels. And if you look on a smaller device, that actually looks pretty good. So good use of responsive techniques. I have no margin on the top and bottom, and I have an auto margin on the right or left, and that centers it. The UL, I have a list style type of none. That gets rid of the bullet points. So even though these are list items, you don't see the bullet point in front of them. And the label I said is a width of 40%. That's 40% of the available space. I make it inline block, which keeps it as an inline tag, but allows me to apply some of the characteristics of a block tag to it. And I align those right. That makes for a clean line here where the labels are right aligned in their area and the text boxes by default are left aligned. So that makes these boxes line up very neatly and these radio buttons line up very neatly. There's obviously more you can do with forms, but this is a good basic way to style your forms. All right, a couple of things. If you have questions about the lab, you can ask me them when the lecture ends. If not, I will log off and be looking for your questions on Canvas. Check the end of the week to see what the classes will be, how the classes will be organized next week, whether they will be in person or virtual again. So are there any questions about your labs or anything else? All right, excellent. That's all I had for today. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week.